of the Center and a professor of political science at Boston College. And thank you for joining us to launch this year's theme, which is democratic resilience. Why choose the word resilience? Well, the term has different meanings in different contexts, social, psychological, ecological, but the concept always involves two critical qualities: elasticity and evolution. The sociologist Michel Lamont described social resilience as the capacity to absorb disturbance and reorganize while undergoing change to retain the same function, structure, and identity. In other words, to be resilient is not to survive in the same form as before. It implies modification, to adapt and thrive in new circumstances and be better able to respond to future shocks. When the Nobel laureate Amartya Sen was asked a quarter century ago to name the most important development of the 20th century, he did not hesitate to say it was the rise of democracy as the preeminently acceptable form of governance. Yet, that is a fragile legacy. After the third democratic wave crested in the 1990s, bringing millions a step forward, the first decades of this century foretold millions more taking two steps back. Half of 167 countries registered a meaningful decline in their democratic index score in the last decade. And the number of countries classified as democracies fell from 79 in 2006 to 71 today. The share of the world's population living in a democracy is shrinking, and that's not merely a function of demographic trends. Democratic backsliding, or de-democratization, is a concern that has grown in tandem with political polarization, rising economic inequalities, the erosion of political parties, the fragmentation of our media landscape. Now, democracy's perennial concern with its own well-being is well known. As Michael Ignatieff put it, democratic self-rule is an unending argument about what democracy is, end quote. Moreover, we know constitutional democracies to be a work in progress, and written on parchment, not etched in stone, subject to amendment and interpretation. And that's part of the gradual democratization that has extended the rule of law, not just to more territories, but to more citizens inside those territories. But history has repeatedly shown that rights can also falter. In the USA, many fear the onset of a constitutional crisis, given the extraordinary ambitions of the White House to wield its power over other branches of government and civil society. Where you stand depends in part on where you are situated politically. According to Bright Line Watch, a scholarly group, the partisan gap in rating the quality of US democracy is at its largest in a decade. Republicans' faith in US democracy reached its low point in January of 2021, whereas the low point for Democrats' faith in American democracy is right now. You would find similarly bifurcated judgments of institutional performance in Turkey or Tunisia or other highly polarized societies before and after major electoral realignments. But yet, even if some of today's worries belong to the cut and thrust of political alternation, this is much more than a partisan divide between electoral winners and losers. It does not seem like mere taboos are being broken. We can see with our own eyes a rise in political violence, strident partisanship, a fraying sense of unity, and, as has taken place elsewhere, an assertive national government is probing the defenses of its civil society, testing how far personalized rule can reach into broadcasting boardrooms and university curricula. This struggle for preeminence raises fundamental questions about checks and balances and about popular sovereignty. Must the executive spend what the legislature has appropriated? When may the president overrule governors or replace independent agency heads? The Supreme Court will answer these and more questions related to the balance of powers, which may or may not settle the matter, since, like other institutions, the court too suffers from decreasing legitimacy. But the judiciary is just one potential source of resilience. It is easy to despair, but it is also easy to lose historical perspective, which brings me back to our initial premise and set of questions. How do societies make their way through challenging circumstances and recover stability? How do voters and civil society groups confront strategies to divide them and overcome collective action dilemmas? How will our democracies adapt and improve their functioning? At the Clough Center this year, our students and fellows and affiliates are exploring this metaphor of democratic resilience. They've begun to meet in seminars and to prepare articles for our spring journal. One essay will come from a legal scholar, Andres Mosquera, called Proving Plato Wrong, The Conditional Resilience of Modern Democracies. A theologian, Brandon, will contribute on democratic resilience and global Christianity. From a literature PhD, we will read about media and democratic resilience in the American Revolution. A philosophy student is writing about universities as bastions of democratic resilience. And in the spring, a delegation from the center will visit Bogota, Colombia, to research the sources of democratic resilience there. So in addition to acknowledging the contributions of Chuck and Gloria Clough for creating the Clough Center, allow me to also express my thanks to Jim Keenan and to Eric Owens and their program on global ethics and social trust for their support of our fall programming. You can find our last event featuring a discussion of US politics on our website. And please note on your calendars that our next event will be held on November 6th, covering the quest for democracy in North Africa with former Prime Minister Youssef Chahed of Tunisia. Today, our attention goes to several other regions of the globe across a lengthy time span. And we have 4 experts here to guide us in our exploration. They will speak 2 at a time, in each case followed by a brief Q&A, and we've asked them to keep their remarks to around 15 minutes, and I'll ask you that you please remain seated during the changeover from one panel to the next. So if I could invite up the first 2 panelists to join me, Professor Robert Bartlett and Professor Sheri Berman, and I will introduce, please come on up. You can take a seat, and then one of you can either speak from the podium or remain where you are. It's as you wish. So, first panel is titled, The Resilience of Western Democracies in Antiquity and Modernity. And I'm going to introduce the panelists in reverse speaking order. So first of all, we are thrilled to welcome back Professor Sheri Berman to Boston College. Professor Berman spoke at the center last November to help us unpack the mega electoral year of 2024. She is a professor of political science and chair of political science at Barnard College, Columbia University. And her research interests include European history and politics, the development of democracy, populism and fascism, and the history of the left. She writes about these topics for the New York Times, Washington Post, and she is the author most recently of Democracy and Dictatorship in Europe, from the Ancien Régime to the present day. Thank you, Sheri, for making the trip up from New York today to be here with us. And now to introduce our first speaker, Professor Robert Bartlett. Professor Bartlett is the first Beirakis Professor of Hellenic Political Studies at Boston College. His research interests span classical political philosophy, especially Thucydides, Plato, Xenophon, and Aristotle. His most recent book is called Against Demagogues, What Aristophanes Can Teach Us About the Perils of Populism and the Fate of Democracy. Professor Bartlett is here to provide us with a classical perspective on democratic resilience. Please join me in welcoming the 2 speakers.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. It's a pleasure to be here. I take it this doesn't amplify, so I'll try to shout. We'll test my resilience because I just taught a 3-hour seminar, so we'll see. My principal area of research is classical political philosophy, Plato, Aristotle. And so my main concerns are really quite far from contemporary American or European politics. Still, if you read the great texts of classical political philosophy with their very vivid portraits of democracy, oligarchy, and tyranny, it's easy to begin to reflect, to apply those readings to some of the strengths and weaknesses of contemporary politics, democratic politics in particular. Now, I want to begin from a matter of definition. What Plato and Aristotle meant by democracy is quite a different animal from the thing that you and I probably mean by it. For the ancients generally, democracy did not signify the rule of everybody in the community, we the people. It signified instead the rule of one and only one class, although it was by far the largest class, that of the demos. Democracy is the rule of that class, the demos. And it's not only the largest class, it was by definition also the poorest, there being very little of what we would call a middle class then. But to be poor was to be also mostly uneducated, since there wasn't then the system of free, if also mediocre, public education that we have. The demos has to be distinguished especially from the few, the oligoi, as it is in Greek, be they the few rich or the self-styled nobles, the well-born, and so on. And they lent their name to the chief competitor to democracy, namely oligarchy, the rule of the few. And so we have the rule of the many, democracy, versus the rule of the few, the oligarchy. And to put all of this together, Plato and Aristotle knew democracy as the rule of the mostly uneducated masses, who, being a numerical majority, could and did pass laws favorable to their own class. And that rule, it should be said, was far more democratic than anything that we know, in the sense that it was a direct democracy, not a representative one. All the citizens gathered together in a single ecclesia to vote up or down laws. And this had the additional consequence or the requirement that such democracies were quite small. Athens at its heyday had maybe 40,000 citizens. And so it was that James Madison in the 10th Federalist paper denied that the United States was what he called a pure democracy, because he had before his eyes the classical model, the polis. The new country of the United States was instead to be a radically novel kind of republic in two respects. It would be a representative government, as distinguished from a direct democracy, and so, accordingly, it would be vast in size, massive. So with that much as a preface, let me turn to resilience. I take resilience to be the capacity of a specific regime to endure in the face of challenges to its continuation. Challenges that could come from within or from without, enemies foreign or domestic, if you like. But for the purposes of my remarks, I'll focus exclusively on the threats that democratic or republican governance faces from within, rather than from without. And I'll do this partly on the basis of the authority of Abraham Lincoln. This is what he said in his Lyceum address. At what point shall we expect the approach of danger? By what means shall we fortify against it? Shall we expect some transatlantic military giant to step across the ocean and crush us at a blow? Never. At what point then is the approach of danger to be expected? I answer, if it ever reach us, it must spring up amongst us. It cannot come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author. As a nation of free men, we must live through all time or die by suicide. I take it that the question on the table for us today is the suicidal tendencies of modern democracy. Now, in the matter of resilience, ancient democracy had a mixed record. Many of them ping-ponged, vacillated between oligarchy and democracy. Athens fared rather better. If you date the beginning of democratic Athens from the expulsion of the tyrant Hippias in 510, you could say that that regime lasted with a couple of brief interruptions until its domination first by Philip of Macedon in 338, and then by his son, of course, Alexander. At that point, Athens ceased to be an independent political community. So let's call it a run of about 180 years or so. Athens' greatest competitor, Sparta, not a democracy but a sort of mixed regime, is said by Thucydides to have had the same regime for some 400 years, an astonishing record of stability. Now, Aristotle contends that democracy is much more stable than oligarchy, for a simple reason. In a democracy, the majority of the city is in favor of the regime. Quote, democracy is more stable and freer from factional conflict than is oligarchy. In oligarchies, two kinds of factional conflict arise, one against each other, one against the demos. In democracies, there's only factional conflict against the oligarchy, there being none that arises worth mentioning among the people itself. Now, the conflict between the poor and the few can take several forms. Generally speaking, the few try to keep the people from any real power, and the demos, using their superiority, attempt to take ever more property from the few. The rallying cry that the rich should pay their fair share tends in practice to mean they can never pay enough, and so begins civil strife. But I want to leave aside classical democracy for just a moment and turn instead to the two kinds of regimes that Aristotle thought were both more stable and better than classical democracy. The first of these he calls polity, which is a kind of judicious mixing in the institutions of democratic and oligarchic elements. And second, what he calls the best practicable regime, which is the regime of the middle class. As for polity, he says a good one will ensure a distribution of powers to both classes, rich and poor. So, for example, you could pay the poor to attend the assembly and fine the rich if they don't come, so you get both to go. Some offices can be chosen by lot, like our jury system, very democratic. Other offices, however, have to be by election, which is more oligarchic. Aristotle suggests that if it's difficult to identify a regime as either an oligarchy or a democracy, that's a good sign that it's well mixed. He cites Sparta as an example. It should appear, as he says, to be both and neither. In the best case, then, the two warring elements will be mixed such that each has some say and some stake in the regime. Now, the other way to overcome the usual tensions between rich and poor is to seek power with neither, the regime founded on the middle class. Now, as I already noted, there wasn't much of a middle class in the ancient world. That would await a John Locke, among others, to expand dramatically the middle class. Nonetheless, he says, Aristotle says, that citizens of the middle class, quote, most especially preserve themselves. They don't desire what belongs to others, as the poor do, nor do others desire what belongs to them, since the poor desire the property of the wealthy and not the middle class. He contends that this regime of the middle class, quote, alone is without factional conflict. For where the middling element is numerous, factional conflicts over the regime occur least of all. He even adds here, in anticipation of part of the argument of Federalist 10, to expand the Republic, that, quote, large cities are freer of factional conflict for the same reason, that the middling element is numerous in them. Now, the United States has, by any classical standard, a massive middle class. And this serves as a great ballast, whose importance, I think, to democratic resilience, it would be difficult to overstate. Should something happen to the middle class, we are in big trouble. We still have rich and poor, of course, but the rich, and for that matter, the poor, can find themselves in either political party today. The political significance of wealth isn't quite what it once was. The Democratic Party can't simply be equated with the interests of the demos, the Republican with those of the oligoi. In fact, I've heard it said that the Democratic Party is now a party of wealthy coastal elites, and the Republican Party, tariffs, anyone, is no longer simply the party of Wall Street. Collars white and blue coexist there. The US also combines elements of the two sorts of regimes that Aristotle thought was most stable and most resilient. The regime of the middle class, of course, and the mixed polity. On the Democratic side, for example, we have the jury system, as I mentioned, the guarantee of one man, one vote, and the fundamental moral principle that all men are created equal. On the more aristocratic side, there's the very idea of election, as opposed to selection by lot, picking a name out of a hat, the process of nomination, the Supreme Court, the Senate, and so on. To these, we can add the separation of powers that's intended to channel narrow ambition such that it's compelled to serve the common good. Now, these and other characteristic institutions are responsible, I think, for the remarkable stability the United States has enjoyed and I think still enjoys. But if that's so, The stability will in large measure depend on the continuing respect for and adherence to these institutional arrangements. And that requires understanding their purpose, to secure the republic and the rights guaranteed thereby. A sign of the trouble ahead, maybe, is the fact that respectable organs of the press have published arguments of respectable scholars to the effect that the United States Constitution needs to be not just amended, but abandoned. Heated argument about the meaning of this or that constitutional provision is old hat and healthy. Mainstream voices contending that the whole thing needs to be scrapped, that is new and to my mind a cause for concern. These days we hear a lot about polarization, and understandably. I'd like to read to you Aristotle's account of a roughly comparable phenomenon, relating not just to political parties, but to partisans of democracy and oligarchy, the old enemies. This is what Aristotle says. It is not the greatest nor the only task of the legislator and those who wish to constitute a particular regime to found it, but rather to see to it that that regime be preserved. It's not difficult to be governed in this or that way for 1 or 2 or 3 days. And so when it comes to what things preserve and destroy regimes, one ought to try to institute stability. And one shouldn't regard as characteristically democratic or oligarchic what will make the city ruled in a democratic or oligarchic way to the greatest extent possible, but rather what will make it last for the longest time. In other words, precisely the democratic and oligarchic partisans ought to see to it not that their form of regime be the purest, the most extreme version of the thing, but that it be constructed in such a way as to last or to endure. And this goal means, in turn, being willing to moderate your own claims in the direction of its rival, not out of a sense of fair play or even compromise, but out of a clear-eyed calculation of what benefits the democracy or oligarchy the most. To moderate its claims somewhat so as not to arouse the ire of its opposite. To push your claim as far as possible, Aristotle suggests, is to run the very real risk of provoking the anger or indignation of your opponents. This is a lesson in Aristotelian moderation, or, if you like, in political physics. For every political action, there is an opposite and equal, or more than equal, reaction. In our own time, then, calculation or prudence should teach us to be wary of calls for ever more or greater democracy. Precisely if we are enthusiastic supporters of democracy, for whom the cure for every ill of democracy appears to be more democracy, we should be alive to the probability that as the regime becomes purer in type, the resistance to it will increase, thereby also increasing the risk of faction. And such factions, if they're deeply disaffected, threaten to undermine the careful balancing of powers for which modern republicanism is rightly known. This lesson in political physics is surely difficult to accept or to act on. But the so-called progressive wing of the Democratic Party is being taught that lesson right now. And it's a lesson that the so-called far right will presumably be taught one day too, in the administration of, say, President Ocasio-Cortez. What may be more, since all political factions today appeal to the only moral authority of our time, namely democracy, the greatest threat to democracy may come from those who claim that emergency measures are needed immediately in order to save it. For what can't be done? What couldn't be excused in the name of saving democracy? It's probably a defect of mine, I admit it, but I'm made most nervous by those who shout the loudest about threats to democracy. All elite institutions in this country, including what's now called the mainstream media, are keeping an eagle-eyed vigilance for signs of the rise of authoritarianism and even fascism. A fact that it seems to me we should be grateful for. I am. But that same vigilance, looking solely off to the right, may be blind to whatever threats to the liberal democracy as may come also from the authoritarian left. For there is such a left. Last point. As I hope to have shown, Aristotle in his political science is very much concerned with the resilience of regimes. A mediocre regime, if it is stable, is less bad than the chaos of civil war. But this is only a part of Aristotle's concern, because his political science is at its core normative. He's concerned not only with the resilience of a regime, in other words, but also with its goodness or its excellence. As the case of Sparta shows, a deeply flawed regime can last for an amazingly long time. Perhaps the most we can reasonably hope for then, as in the case of democratic Athens, is for a community to come into being, to flourish spectacularly for a good while, a couple of centuries or so, and then, as seems inevitable, alas, begin to fade. As it was put by Pericles, the greatest democratic statesman of his day, quote, "All things by nature also decline." Thank you.
Okay. All right, let's see. Ah, wonderful. Okay, and on that super depressing note, I will switch us to a discussion of the present day, which honestly is also fairly depressing. So I will actually start, because I'm a boring political scientist, with some graphs that actually reflect some information that Professor Lawrence started us off with. So we're having a seminar, or you guys are having a seminar on democratic resilience because we're worried about democratic resilience in a way that we would not have been worried 20 years ago. So if you look at this first graph, it sort of has, sort of a chart by three of the most well-known and well-respected kind of think tanks that track the progress of democracy. And you can see here that starting at about 2006, all of them, they use slightly different measures. Note that there has been a decline in, global democracy ratings. You can see this in a different way here, slightly different starting point. This is just tracking how many countries, again, using similar kinds of measures, how many countries are becoming more democratic as opposed to becoming less. And so you can see that, sort of around that point, 2006, 2010, we have a significant decline, right? There are many more countries kind of going backwards in the quality of their democracies or towards democracy, as opposed to those that are moving in a less democratic or authoritarian direction. So globally, there's a reason why we're having this conversation. But I want to begin by saying that despite this sort of overall global trend, there are some parts of it that are even more troubling than others, right? So the reason why the 2006 starting point or 2010 is there is that's the point in all of human history, right? Maybe not, I won't go back. Let me say modern human history, since we just had a classicist here. That was the height of what political scientists call the third wave. At that point, there were more democracies in existence on the globe than had ever existed before, right? So this third wave starts in the late 20th century, right? We use the term wave just to kind of capture periods of time when lots of countries move in a similar direction, right? So we had a wave of democracy that began in the late 20th century. It swept over pretty much almost every area of the globe, Eastern Europe, obviously parts of the former Soviet Empire, Latin America, Africa. We had waves in the past, right? Some of you are probably familiar with the ones, at least in the 20th century, after the First World War, big wave of democratization, after the Second World War. And just to stop for a second, as a, sort of a Europeanist, in addition to being a scholar of democracy, it's only after the Second World War, right, that wave, that we actually get stable, what we call sometimes consolidated democracy in Western Europe, right? And we don't get democracy in Southern or Eastern Europe until the third wave. So it's just important to recognize how recent it is in some places in a comparative perspective. Now, we use the term waves, but a wave, as anybody who's ever been to the beach or knows anything about waves knows, there's always undertows to waves. Otherwise, obviously, we'd be a globe covered by water. Now, the reason why there's undertows with democratic waves is that it's actually very hard to make democracy work. And so when you have these periods of great transitions, a lot of countries that make these transitions from authoritarian to democratic regimes simply are not able to build up the infrastructure of democracy, right? So they topple an old regime, but they can't put together the infrastructure of democracy. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that, right? And when we think about the infrastructure of democracy, things that pop into mind, we're in a Center for Constitution and Democracy, constitutions, checks and balances, active civil societies, free press, well-functioning political parties, and, crucially, legitimacy among citizens. I'm going to talk more about that. Now, even though, right, we've had this global decline in democracy, right, actually from a historical perspective, the fact that there was this undertow, this decline beginning in around 2006, 2010, is not, from a historical perspective, as I've indicated, should have been unexpected, right? It's saddening, but not surprising. We know from previous waves, for the reasons I said, that many countries that make the transition actually are not going to succeed. What's distinctive about what's happened since 2006 or 2010, accordingly, is not that many new democracies have faltered. It's that we've actually begun to see democracies that we considered solidly in the consolidated, well-established camp falling apart or eroding. But even here, actually, there are important distinctions to make, right? If we look at the other obvious sort of place where there's lots of what we consider to be, you know, relatively well-functioning, long-established democracies, Western Europe, right? There actually hasn't been democratic decay in Western Europe, using, again, the measures that, you know, scholars and other kinds of analysts tend to use. Democracy has actually continued to function fairly well in Western Europe, despite, I would point out, the fact that here, too, you have rising support for populism. The real outlier is the United States. Now, there are other countries, too, Israel and India, two other long-established democracies where scholars have also noted declines, but the United States is really the outlier here. And again, the United States has been around for a very long time, and we thought our democratic institutions were kind of, you know, in the bag. But in fact, we've seen a significant amount of democratic decay over the last decade or so. And so the question really is why? How can we kind of understand this? Typically, when political scientists have looked at resilience, why are some democracies more resilient than others, they tend to focus on institutions to understand that, right? So we have here the Clough Center for the Study of Constitutional Democracy, right? Constitutions, as I said, checks and balances, civilian control of the military, free press, active society, these kinds of things. Do these things exist, right? Have they been around for a long time? The assumption is if they're well designed and they've been around for a long time, that they will be resilient. They will have the ability, as Professor Bartlett kind of pointed out, to withstand challenges. So for example, not that long ago, one of the most well-known scholars studying democracy, a fellow named Adam Przeworski, wrote in a very influential article that based on his statistical analyses, right, that the American combination of high income, or obviously an advanced industrial economy, and our long history of democracy made the probability of democratic erosion nearly zero. Now, that clearly turned out to be wrong, and even Przeworski has said, I don't know, I'm just completely and utterly surprised by what has been going on in the United States for the last 10 years. So how do we understand this, right? I want to get back to this idea about institutions and resilience, right? When political scientists think about resilience, as I mentioned, they really focus a lot on institutions. So when we talk today, or the media talks today, what's going on in our country that's so terrible, right? We talk about what we see as attacks on our democratic institutions, constitutions, separation of powers, attacks on the free press, attacks on civil society, right? We call that in political science, since there's always a room for a little terminology, input legitimacy, right? Democracy's nature is its institutions. Democracy's resilience comes from those institutions and procedures, right? They're not just the crucial components of democracy, it's what gives them strength and legitimacy, or rather resilience. And if they're well designed, as I said, and long lasting, the assumption is that they will be resilient. They will last over time. But of course, there's much more to democracy than this. And I actually think one of the things that the last 10 or 15 years has forced us to realize is something pretty obvious, but that I think a lot of us in the scholarly community had kind of pushed aside, which is that when citizens think about democracy, they're not only thinking about inputs, they're thinking about outputs. Does democracy deliver? Is it responding to my needs and the needs of my communities? From this perspective, if democracy does not deliver, if the establishment does not deliver, if it doesn't respond to citizens' demands and grievances, then it is going to lose the support of citizens over time. And I think that that is, in fact, a lot of what we have seen going on here in the United States. So if we look just at some, sort of straightforward kinds of measures here, right? If you look at American satisfaction with the direction of the U.S., just kind of in general, how do you think the country's doing? You can see that it's not. Generally, Americans are not particularly happy with where the country is and where the country is going. If we look at economic outcomes, right? This comes from a very recent article in the Wall Street Journal that got a lot of attention. Very, very high levels of dissatisfaction with economic performance or outcomes. Do people like me, right, whoever's being asked, have a good chance of improving our standard of living? That number has gone down. This is the kind of American dream. People no longer believe that the economy is capable of delivering for people like them. Particularly, of course, the working class, which we spend a lot of time talking about, has done particularly poorly over the last decades, right? Not sharing in the growth that has existed to the same extent that it did during those post-war decades, right? So this is something new. I mean, obviously, some people are always wealthier than others, but the amount that people in the, sort of working class have gotten from what has been objectively even slower growth has declined over those years. There's also a disconnect between what citizens say they want or prefer and non-economic outcomes as well, right? This is very clear on a whole variety of non-economic issues, immigration being perhaps the most prominent, but certainly not the only one, right? And a lot of talk also since the last election on how far away the Democrats seemed from your average voter, not just, your Trump voter, but your median voter on these issues, right? And so this, again, another reflection of that. When people were polled and asked, where the different candidates stood vis-a-vis their own views, right? Harris came out as much more extreme, believe it or not, than Trump did on these issues, right? So again, just a few data points. The point here is that there is a lot of dissatisfaction in this country on broad issues. What is the United States? Where is it going? Is it going in a positive direction? Has the economy been working for me and for my family and for my communities? Is the government delivering on non-economic issues in ways that are consistent with my preferences? So I guess what I just want to say here again is something pretty simple. When people do not believe that democratic governments, democratic institutions, the establishment, right, are delivering, all of those things are going to lose legitimacy and hence resilience over time, right? The backsliding that we've seen in the United States over the past years is the culmination of a longer trend, right? I wrote down, this old adage that I often come back to from Ernest Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises, where his character, Mike Campbell, and some of you older folks are probably familiar with this, when asked how he went bankrupt, he responds two ways: gradually and then suddenly, right? And this is just sort of supposed to capture the way crises happen, right? There's a sort of gradual erosion of the foundations, and then some trigger comes, and everything collapses, right? And so the way I view someone like Donald Trump is that he was particularly effective at capturing, mobilizing, deepening dissatisfaction that was already there. He did not create it. He just took advantage of it in a particularly successful way. So again, I'll stop here, and what I want to say is if we want to understand democratic resilience, right, and its flip side, democratic erosion, that's what you have when there's resilience begins to break down. you need to focus on both input and output legitimacy, to use those political science terms, right? Populists, radicals, authoritarians, they thrive on dissatisfaction, right? And they thrive on dissatisfaction for citizens, I think, most viscerally on that performance kind of output, right? When there is this kind of dissatisfaction, when people don't see those institutions and those establishment politicians and parties delivering, right, they are much more amenable to folks who come to power and then begin undermining those and attacking those institutions, right? No matter how well designed, no matter how long lived our democratic institutions are, they're not free floating. Their resilience depends on the continued support of citizens. And when they start losing that support, we should expect to see, again, the possibility for perhaps surprising, but should not be surprising, lack of resilience. Thanks.
Well, thank you both very much for very thought-provoking presentations, and I would first ask Bob or Sheri if you wanted to comment on one another's presentations, since in some ways, Bob, you maybe seem to emphasize the process element in vis-a-vis Sheri's emphasis on the delivery of outcomes, and I wonder what you make of that contrast.
I'm not sure what to make of that contrast. I do have a question related to something you said, if I may. It was fascinating. You mentioned twice populism. And there is an argument to be made. I wouldn't make it, but there is an argument to be made that, in fact, that's more democratic, right? What is populism but the people speaking up, dissatisfaction that you brought out so well. So could you say something a bit more about what you mean by populism and its threat to democracy?
Sure.
If you regard it as a threat.
No, sure. So, I don't know if this is, I suppose people can hear me. So that is a term that, sort of is quite vague. Populism, if what we're talking about is politicians and parties that respond to people's demands and grievances, that is absolutely not undemocratic. It's almost like you said, a tautology. The question is whether or not politicians use that disjuncture of dissatisfaction then to begin undermining democratic institutions. The threat, the problem is there, right? Democracy is not threatened by differences of opinion or differences over policy, right? So when political scientists, for instance, look at what's going on in the United States, it's less the policies that are advocated by whoever, whether it's Trump or Biden, if you think. It's what's been going on, what have those politicians and parties done vis-a-vis these core institutional features or core infrastructural aspects of democracy, right? So populism, if we're talking about, okay, people who come to power and say, look, the establishment has been screwing you over and I'm going to be more responsive to your needs, that's not a threat to democracy at all. What's a threat is if you take that dissatisfaction and then you use it as an excuse to undermine the very institutions that allow, again, as you sort of pointed out a little bit in your talk, but I think most people are intuitively understand, those institutions and procedures that allow us to continually, in an iterative fashion, sort of solve our differences, make our claims, yada, yada, yada.
Yeah.
So fair enough. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
So I'd just like to take maybe one or two questions in the interest of time. So if I can invite anyone from this side of the room. Yes, Herbert, let me give you a microphone.
Thank you, professors, for your talk. Professor Sheri, if I could play with the words, I would say Brazilians. Brazil plus resilience, talking about the Brazilian democratic resilience. And as you spoke about the power or the importance of institutions, it seems that the judiciary institution in Brazil is holding democracy there. Is it correct?
Any comment on the Brazilian judiciary's
Well,
role?
I'm not a Brazilian expert. I will say that there is a lot of discussion among scholars of democracy of the Brazilian case for precisely this reason, because it did seem to have done a better job of holding politicians, figures in the army, whatever, accountable for attacks on democracy. There's some question among democratic scholars, again, about checks and balances, right? Like, so, you want a judiciary that's able to do what a judiciary is supposed to do, which is protect constitutional norms, but you're also wary, if you're a democratic scholar, of judiciaries that are impinging a little bit on some other aspects of the democratic process. But it's a great case and an interesting comparison because it was cotemporous almost, yeah.
Hannes Kerber.
Thank you so much for two very thoughtful presentations. I have a question, I think, for both of you. You, in both talks, the importance of institutions for democracy were mentioned. And you called those institutions democratic institutions. There are also a lot of non-democratic, not anti-democratic, of course, but non-democratic institutions that seem terribly important for democracies to work. For example, we could argue that parties worked better when they were less democratic in a way, right? When they worked, when primaries were not as populist, you could say. So I wondered whether you could comment on non-democratic institutions.
I mean, I agree with that, and I think that's in the spirit, at least, of Aristotle's analysis of the ancient republic, when it's well functioning properly, and that he had Aristotle, Plato, and other of the classical thinkers had serious reservations about pure democracy, as I tried to indicate in my talk, and so that he describes but also encourages the judicious mixing through institutions of both democratic and more oligarchic or aristocratic institutions. I mean, the United States, this is why the terminology gets confusing. We always speak of democracy, but it's a complicated republic with a lot of aristocratic or quasi-aristocratic features shot through. We don't think of the Senate, which is now elected directly, but of course it wasn't originally. The president, the Supreme Court, and other things. Even, as I said in my talk, the idea of election and running for nomination is not simply democratic. It smacks, at least from the ancient point of view, it smacks certainly of something like an aristocracy. And I think many of the founders of the United States would say, yes, that's right, exactly. Because we don't want a simply untrammeled voice of the people. We want it refined, complicated, and elevated.
So I would answer the question, but in a slightly different way, since I'm a modern political scientist. When we talk about democracy, like Professor Bartlett said, we use that term, but we use it loosely, right? What we're really talking about is liberal democracy, right? And to my mind, liberal it performs a similar function. It's supposed to constrain democracy, right? So I always tell my students the Bill of Rights, right? Those are inalienable rights, right? We have those there because you're not supposed to legislate on them. The point is they are outside of the democratic process, right? And so, you could have a pure democracy where people had free and fair elections and then you could vote on anything. Nobody wants that, right? That's a democracy on some level. But when we're talking in the modern sense, we're really talking about a liberal democracy. So there are constraints built in. I would be very careful, though, about how to characterize certain kinds of things. So for instance, primaries, you're right. The irony of something like that is they were designed to improve democracy in the sense of giving the people more opportunity to choose the candidates that would ultimately be running for office. But in fact, they have turned out to be precisely not that, because we know that the people who vote in primaries are small in number and unrepresentative. And so, some of the times what we have is this problem of, trying to improve democracy and then realizing that in fact we have made it less democratic. So thinking about the ways in which you can restore that balance, to use the terms, I think, or the terminology that Professor Bartlett so well used, that's really very difficult. And it's not always obvious, how those kinds of changes are going to turn out.
So I am going to just end the conversation right now, just so we can switch to the second panel. And if you do have a question still in your mind, hold on to it, and hopefully we can get to you in that second round. But please join me in thanking Professor Berman and Professor Bartlett. And so now for the second panel, which is titled Assessing Democratic Resilience in East Asia, Russia, and Beyond, We will cover a different subset of issues and bring in more cases and countries, and I'm delighted to have our two speakers with us. First to go will be Ingu Hwang, who is an associate professor of the practice in the International Studies program and a faculty board member of the Asian Studies program at Boston College. His research and teaching focus on modern Korean history and politics, Cold War East Asian diplomacy, and the history of human rights and humanitarianism. His recent book is called Transnational Democratization, Human Rights in South Korea and U.S. Cold War Policy. And finally, batting cleanup will be my dear colleague, Professor Jerry Easter.
Your dear leader.
My dear leader. Right. Political science departments are also not democracies. Jerry has been a member of the Boston College faculty since the year 2000, teaching courses in comparative politics with a regional focus on Russia and Eastern Europe. His interests include the modern state, post-communist transitions, comparative political economy, and he is currently working on projects related to the comparative politics of policing and pre-modern politics. And he is the author of numerous books about Russian politics, economics, and society, including The Tsarina's Lost Treasure and The Last Stand of the Raven Clan. First to go, however, will be Ingu Hwang, and I welcome you to the floor.
Good afternoon. First of all, thank you, Jonathan, for inviting me to this invaluable meeting. I'd like to share some reflection on democratic resilience from the historical perspective of Korea and East Asia. And South Korea, along with Taiwan, represent one or two exemplary cases in which, by the end of 20th century, former colony could develop both democracy and modern economy. And less than a year ago, a short-lived coup attempt in South Korea called international attention to social and political strength of democracy. If you understand democratic resilience, I captured from the Clough Center webpage, and today actually gave more in-depth definition about democratic resilience. But quite similar, like you highlight about elasticity and evolution, but if I keep the definition as a capacity of institutions and people to resist significant socio-economic and cultural political challenges to democracy, I think South Korea's recent turbulence may offer a critical vantage point. It will help rethink the challenges and opportunities that South Korea faces in democracy and also other parts of the world. So let me begin by briefly reviewing the dramatic event surrounding the coup attempt. So on December 3rd, 2024, President Yoon Suk-yeol declared martial law to eliminate his political opponents. And he labeled the critics and opposition lawmakers as anti-state forces. So this marked the first time that a democratically elected president mobilized troops and for the domestic political advantage. So this declaration triggered immediate resistance. Unarmed citizens rushed together outside the National Assembly and forming a human blockade and to prevent troop advancement. And also, some soldiers resisted orders, somehow passively, just delaying, and somehow actively, just refusing to comply. Within a few hours, 190 members of National Assembly passed a resolution to lift the martial law decree and forcing the Yoon to rescind and the order. 10 days later, the Assembly voted to impeach Yoon. And on April 4th, the Constitutional Court upheld the impeachment. In the snap election on June 3rd, and Lee Jae-myung of the Democratic Party was elected president. Since then, special prosecutorial investigation and trials continue. So my question is here, what enabled South Korean people to prevent this moment of democratic declining and backsliding, and from turning into the total breakdown of democracy. So I'd like to call your attention to Korea's past to identify significant sources of democratic resilience. So first, South Korea's democratic resilience is rooted in a deeply institutionalized culture of democracy and human rights that began to take shape in the 1970s. So during the period, democratization movements emerged in response to President Park Chung-hee's increasingly authoritarian rule. And this democratization movement coincided with the global rise of human rights, norms, and politics, which South Korean activists encountered through their constructive engagement with international organizations, Amnesty International, World Council of Churches, as well as liberal internationalists on U.S. Congress. Importantly, rather than adopting Western human rights framework, these local activists vernacularize these norms. They used these adapted norms to advocate for democratization and human rights protections within South Korea and also on the global stage. By the 1980s, democracy and human rights had become the unifying framework, and with the tentative alliance in the 1970s, workers, religious leaders, and student activists, and solidified into a powerful mass movement. In the 1987, this movement succeeded in pressuring South Korean authoritarian government to adopt a new constitution. This revised constitution mandated direct presidential election, reaffirmed the sovereignty of the people, and established the constitutional courts, marking a major turning point in the country's democratic transition. This institutionalization of democratic and human rights principles continued to shape Korea's protest culture. In the 1990s, democratic and grassroots organizations initiated building the institutional foundation for transitional justice on colonial and post-colonial atrocities, including the 1979 military coup and also subsequent political crackdown on people in Gwangju in 1980. Perhaps you might be familiar with the book, Hwang's book, Human Acts. And this pursuit culminated in the establishment of crucial institutions in the 2000s, that's National Human Rights Commission and Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Thus, South Korea's decades-long struggle against authoritarianism and its ongoing commitment to social justice and human rights helped cultivate civil society network and protest culture that enabled the large-scale mobilization of citizens and lawmakers to resist President Yoon's martial law decree. This historical legacy also fostered a deep public awareness. Threat to democracy can often arise within the society rather than external forces. This perspective reflected in a constitutional court ruling that declared Yoon's martial law and unconstitutional because it betrayed the people's trust in institutions. In addition to the speed of anti-martial law actions, I'd like to highlight one striking aspect of the 2024 protests, that is their nonviolent, peaceful, and orderly nature. This reflects a deep historical continuity. Democratic dissident leaders in the 1970s and 80s, such as Kim Dae-jung, were profoundly influenced by the philosophies of Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr., particularly their emphasis on nonviolent resistance and civil disobedience. This tradition of peaceful protest continued into the post-democratization era, most notably 2016 and 17 candlelight demonstrations. Every weekend, 1 million or 2 million people gathered to impeach corrupt presidents. Building on the point about the institutionalization of democratic culture, it is important to examine how effectively the country's institution and legal framework protected democracy and human rights during the recent crisis. Like many other democracies, already explained in the previous session, around the world, South Korea faced intense political polarizations in recent years. The two dominant parties, the People Power Party and Democratic Party, they have increasingly villainized one another and to mobilize their support and ultimately result in very intense political gridlock. This toxic climate worsened after Yoon Suk-yeol's election in 2022, as he sought to consolidate power by appointing far-right figures to key government and military posts. Post-crisis investigations have implicated several of those officials in the military and martial law plan, also uncovered evidence of collusion between Yoon, his wife, and business and journalist Myung Tae-gyun, and also a religious cult called Unification or Moonies, to influence parliamentary and presidential elections. However, despite these reactionary schemes, Korea's institution held firm. The National Assembly acted as a crucial safeguard, not only blocking the martial law decree, but also managing extensive hearings on the incident, along with investigation by police and prosecutors, which laid the groundwork for the Constitutional Court's ruling. I would argue the institutional resilience highlights how far Korea has progressed since the 1970s and 80s. Back then, like many other East Asian nations, local democratic activists had to heavily rely on international organizations or U.S. Congress liberal internationalists to create the leverage for domestic and international momentums. Thus, over half a century, South Korea had built robust democratic institutions capable of resisting internal threats to democracy without relying on international or foreign interventions. Finally, I want to highlight how President Yoon Suk-yeol attempted to use historical revisionism as a tool to undermine democratic values. From the outset of his presidential campaign, he expressed admiration for past authoritarian leaders, most notably Chun Doo-hwan, who was responsible for the 1980 massacre in Gwangju. And after taking office, Yoon administration collaborated with the far-right church groups to promote a narrative centered on anti-communism and patriotism, and economic achievement of former authoritarian presidents, while downplaying their use of violence, intimidation, and repression. However, this strategy largely failed. During the 1970s and 80s, pro-democracy activists had campaigned to reveal how authoritarian regimes manipulated public fear of communism and the perceived threat from North Korea to justify political suppression. Protesters such as citizens in Gwangju were often falsely labeled as North Korean infiltrators or communist sympathizers. In the post-democratization era, transition justice advocates continued to correct the historical record, and they accordingly manifested the victims of state violence, including those killed in Gwangju, were not enemies of the state, but ordinary citizens who stood up for democratic principles. Thanks to those earlier campaigns, most citizens were skeptical of President Yoon's portrayal of his critics and opponents as anti-state forces. During the impeachment proceedings, universities in South Korea and abroad, including Boston College, and organized educational events to help young students understand this recent crisis in historical context. So, for example, campuses hosted screenings and discussions of a non-fictional film titled The Soldier Spring, which explored the South Korean struggle during the time of 1979 military coup. So these events ensure that South Korea's past continue to serve as a critical foundation for the democratic future. So let me conclude. So while President Yoon's martial law decree represented a serious democratic crisis, but it also revealed the strength and maturity of the Korean democratic system. Despite the deep political polarizations, the country's protest culture, civil society network, and democratic institutions proved resilient enough to prevent a complete breakdown of democracy. Moreover, the crisis has sparked meaningful grassroots conversations about how to address political polarization, the rise of far-right extremism, declining public trust in institutions, and the misuse of investigation for partisan purposes. So these discussions reflect a continued commitment to ensure Korea's hard-won legacies of democratic achievements. Thank you for your attention.
Okay. I'm Jerry Easter, the chair of political science, and I will wrap up this affair by discussing democratic resilience in Eastern Europe. All right. I'll point out by saying that despite the title, I did understand this to mean liberal democratic resilience. And so my remarks will reflect that interpretation. 1989, of course, is the year that the communism falls in Eastern Europe and begins the process by which Eastern Europe can finally join liberal democratic Western Europe. On May Day in 2004, 8 countries from Eastern Europe were part of the large enlargement of the EU. And it was celebrated on that day across Eastern Europe, but in particular in a small town in the southeast corner of Saxony, in East Germany, at the town of Zittau, where on one road leads to Poland and another road out of the town center leads to the Czech Republic. And on that day, the German Chancellor Schröder, along with the Polish Prime Minister Miller and the Czech Prime Minister Spiedler, was his name, all gathered to raise the EU flag to open up the border in a symbolic gesture to the liberal triumph in Eastern Europe. The liberal triumph after maybe going back to the battles of the French Revolution, of course, yeah? And now liberal Europe had become a reality. There was great optimism at that time. It was a tremendous effort that the EU attempted to incorporate 125 million people, more than 24 countries, into this project. It was very generous and exceedingly ambitious. On this day as well, as part of these ceremonies, there was another fellow there who is German, and he had the job of had a job with the EU for the integration of the East. His name was Hwang, and he remarked on that day that I can't see. Okay, we've finally reached the point in European history where borders do not matter anymore. So it just captures the mood of mid-2000s Eastern Europe. It's not too long after that, I would point to the year 2008, that the liberal project in Eastern Europe began to stall. And it, I would say, remains stalled since that time. And what came in the wake of 2008, which is notable for the financial crisis, but it's also notable for the point at which NATO began to move further east into Eastern Europe and wanted to bring Ukraine and Georgia into the military alliance as well. That this geopolitical imperative was intensified in the region. What has come in the wake is what I would call the post-liberal reckoning in Eastern Europe. The post-liberal reckoning is a reaction to the liberalizing revolution that comes in with 1989, the neoliberal economic policies of 1989, and it manifests itself in socioeconomic, in social cultural, and in political ways. So I'll just sketch those manifestations, and then I'll wrap up by commenting on how well has commenting on democratic resilience in the wake of post-liberalism in Eastern Europe. So socioeconomic things that I think everyone is probably very familiar with, that's driven by the globalization. Eastern Europe will be hit with similar things that happen in Western Europe and are happening in America, like deindustrialization, but they're hit with them more suddenly, and the effects of them are wider and deeper. The economic transformation will lead to an uneven economic development. There'll be some richer regions, urban regions, and some new industrial places are reinvigorated industries from Western manufacturers moving east. But it will also contain very poor regions. The poorest regions in Europe will be found in the east, and in particularly in the southeast. And what doesn't get, in my opinion, nearly as much attention as it should is the social ill effects of that economic revolution in Eastern Europe that impacted health. It impacted mental health, it impacted identity, it impacted population vitality. So that's one element of that's related to the post-liberal turn. The second is social cultural. Eastern Europe remains a bulwark of traditional conservatism. there's a resistance in Eastern Europe to what's seen to Western style consumption and lifestyles that in Eastern Europe either out of reach or just simply seem to be out of sorts. There's a perception of individualism run amok, exists in wide quarters of East European populations. And was resistance to the programs of social progress, that gender, et cetera, that the liberalizing revolution brought. Another element that's social cultural, I'm good, is of course nationalism. So there's a Berkeley historian, John Connolly of Eastern Europe, he's a good historian, and he devised a concept to describe the nationalisms in Eastern Europe. And he calls it a crisis frame of reference. These are small nations that have, for a long time, felt very vulnerable about their survival. They see themselves as victims, they see themselves as martyrs, and they see themselves as desperate. They don't necessarily believe that their nation will survive. And with the socio-cultural revolution, this nationalism was reignited in the later 2000s and in the 2000 teens in the region. This crisis frame of reference, and it comes from competing directions. It comes from the West. It comes from Brussels. It comes from Brussels policies of seeming to infringe on sovereignty of nations that after so long being under the heavy hand of Soviet communism are finally free, but now we're not free because we're part of Brussels and they're trying to micromanage how we want to order our affairs. And that's exacerbated by the immigration refugee crisis, which is also seen to be Brussels related. And then, of course, by the mid-2000 teens comes the resurgent threat of an aggressive Russia pushing westward into and interfering in Ukraine, and bringing a threat over the region again. But that's the social cultural. Those manifest themselves in the region's post-liberal politics. The post-liberal politics witnessed the upending of what had been the traditional kind of left-right division of politics associated with 20th century democracy, and the cleavage, social cleavages that aligned accordingly. Eastern Europe now is rend, I think that's a verb, is rendered by a cleavage between kind of savvy cosmopolitans, these people with high-tech skills, high-end consumption, people who attach themselves to liberal Europe. And the other side is neo-traditionalists, people who have embraced a religious revival. The region also, that's social cultural as well too, I guess, is the higher identity with religion and the greater influence of the church in affairs, in politics. And also a very proud chauvinism, an ethno-national chauvinism. And these political systems are roughly polarized in a very similar and familiar way to what we know now in the West. The polarization has led to two kinds of elites. There's those attached to liberal Europe, which are seen to be kind of horizontal elites. They're connected to people like them in other countries and to Brussels. They take their cues from Brussels technocrats and Davos influences. They speak English. And in Eastern Europe, their speaking English is not it's not unlike the way in which old regime Europe spoke French, even if they weren't in France, but spoke French to each other. They were horizontal elites, not attached to the people in society. Post-liberal elites tend to have these vertical connections. They connect to local business, not the multinationals, not Volkswagen, but to local businesses and to local cultural elites, church people often. And they explicitly, in their political rhetoric, defend the nation. They see the nation under threat. They see the nation being diluted culturally, population-wise, and they speak out against that. Let me see. They're explicitly antagonistic to the liberal elites and try to depict them as being not as being disconnected from the nation, the people. They are very hostile to anything multicultural, anything in terms of aesthetics, gender, etc. So that's a characterization of where politics has gone in this post-liberal reckoning. So the very last thing I'll do now is talk about how has Eastern Europe democracy in Eastern Europe. In the 1990s, throughout almost all the region, there were reforms that created democratic constitutions, multi-party systems, civil rights, competitive electoral systems. How have those democratic systems stood up to the threat of post-liberalism and post-liberal elites? And it's a mixed record. But it's not probably as bleak as one would think. So Viktor Orban is often put forward as the poster child of what's gone wrong in Eastern Europe. And Hungary is a case that indeed democracy has not stood up so well to post-liberalism. But for a while, Poland was even ahead of Hungary on that category. But Polish democratic institutions have managed to work and vote a post-liberal political party out of power. But you see it in places as well where post-liberal elites run and win election to the parliament, become prime ministers, or become presidents in Slovenia, in the Czech Republic, in Slovakia, in Croatia. So there are places where the democracy has been able to work in this environment. The places where it has been less successful is the places where the EU stopped trying to bring in the rest of Eastern Europe into the EU. The parts of the former Yugoslavia and the Western Balkans, those are places where the politics is much more likely, where democratic institutions have been corrupted and subverted by post-liberal politicians. Within the and the second factor that would explain the variation, I think, is places where the political left collapsed are places where post-liberal elites did well, and where the resilience of their fragile democracies fared poorly. All right, and that's all I got to say.
So thank you very much to both of you. At this point, I would invite the audience to pose questions to this panel, but also if you have questions that you want to pose to all of the panelists, I can easily pass the microphone over to Professor Berman and Professor Bartlett as well. So I see a question in the back. May I ask one of our, Mehdi, could I ask you to please hand that microphone to the person in the back row? Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Hwang, for your speech. I just wanted to ask, because you mentioned how, like, since the 1990s, there's been a lot less reliance of South Korea on, like, international organizations. I was just wondering, as a result of things like democratic backsliding in South Korea since the Yoon regime, and because of this, would this lead to a shift in U.S. strategic, like, foreign policy since the Cold War? And if so, does that increase, like, the influence of NGOs and local activists in South Korea due to a lack of outside influence?
Thank you for your question, Shining. So, just perhaps I couldn't understand clearly about your question. But what I want to say about, in terms of impact of U.S. strategic intervention, we need to keep in mind that although I didn't mention this issue in my talk, so in terms of structure, never change it. So, just in terms of like the military structure and geopolitical structure in East Asia, I don't think has any change. But interesting point of this recent crisis, we cannot hear any kind of pressure for the Washington to intervene in this crisis. And also we cannot hear any kind of anti-American slogans. And we should understand still, who is holding the operational control in Korean Peninsula? United States. So United States must have or might have known all of these moving of military troops, and should have known earlier than any kind of, because if you can imagine that North Korea fired missiles 30 seconds later, 1 minute later, just there is an announcement, right? How could not know about this all? But no one questioned this, right? This is a very, so no one bring any kind of the anti-American slogans. That's very contrasting to that happening in the 1980s. But anti-Americanism is not, it should be clear, it's not emotional at all. It's about the criticism or critical voices about the policies. Okay.
Thank you. Do I see, yes, in the front row here. And then to Brandon back.
Well, I just want to say thank you to both of you for the panel. It was great. I had a question for you, Professor Easter.
Yes.
So do you think in Eastern Europe, perhaps the trauma of post-liberal politics and neoliberal economic policies has embedded itself into the population, leading to the collapse of left parties and the flourishing of post-liberal elites in politics?
So just, are you asking, is neoliberal economic policies the root cause of the rise of the post-liberal alternative in Eastern Europe? Is that more or less the question?
Yes, as well as post-liberal political policy being pushed from the West.
Is post-liberalism
sorry.
being pushed from the West?
Oh wait, I'm sorry.
Okay.
I meant
Okay, so I would agree, though, that the neoliberalism in Eastern Europe, the unintended social effects of it have contributed greatly to the possibility for successful post-liberal politics. And the collapse of the left is, in some places it hasn't collapsed, like for example in the Czech Republic, which also has the region's probably showcase democracy. But it collapsed in Poland, it collapsed in Hungary, it did poorly in other places, and it partly has to do with the taint of communism, the taint of the old regime, and it also has to do with some really nasty corruption scandals in those particular places. Yeah. But that's a phenomenon, I think, too, that transcends the region. In my opinion, the rise of Trump has to do with the Democratic Party attaching itself to bankers and generals instead of farmers and workers. But that's just an opinion.
Question from Brandon.
Thank you.
And then we'll go to Professor Banwasisi.
Thank you. So this question responds mostly to Professor Bartlett, although I'm happy to hear anyone's thoughts about it, given the thought from Aristotle. What I think one of your main points was to retrieve from Aristotle the value of stability. But given that part of our conversation is about liberal democracy, Aristotle's framing of it would seem to be not a liberal thing, probably pre-liberal rather than post-liberal. So if, in fact, this conversation does have to do with liberal democracy, what would we accept the sacrifice of the democratic part of democratic resilience? And, what value would we find in working out the kind of trade-off of, a more principled democracy or values of justice related to that for some kind of stability?
Pass him that microphone. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for that. It's a very complicated question. And one of the reasons I began from a kind of attempt at definition is that what Aristotle and Plato meant mostly by democracy is only a very, very distantly related to what we know. And as Professor Berman also noted, what we mean today when we speak about democracy is indeed liberal democracy, whose purpose is a certain protection of liberty, hence liberal democracy, and the rights that go together with it. In general, I would say that Aristotle, like in some ways the American founders, or some of the American founders, were wary of untrammeled democracy or populism. And therefore they began from a notion of individual rights, which is not really present in Aristotle, that's true. That there's no notion, I don't want to go too far into it, but there's no notion of a state of nature in Aristotle, for example, as there is in the theoreticians of the modern liberal dispensation. And that it's a very careful and delicate balancing act between liberty and equality. And there is a version of that in Aristotle, yes, but it's true that the most important hypotheses are somewhat different in the modern era. And I would say that all of the speakers in various ways are dealing with the negotiations that are going on, the different cleavages within a quote-unquote modern liberal democracy, or perhaps post-liberal as the case may be.
Thank you. Professor Banwazizi.
Thank you so much. My question, if I may, is directed to Professor Berman. You mentioned a number of sources of discontent, non-institutional discontents that are challenging democracy. I wonder if the discontents coming from the religious communities, in particular the evangelical Christians, you see them as also a threat to democracy. This also relates to another point that you made, that in our democracy there are certain non-negotiable ideas or ideals. You mentioned, all men are created equal as an example of that. I wonder if you consider the separation of the church and state as another non-negotiable item, and in that sense this relates to the first part of the question, that this threat to democracy is a real threat or not, in your judgment.
So that's a lot of difficult questions. I would say that one perfectly reasonable interpretation of what's been going on in the United States and in other Western or semi-Western democracies like in Eastern Europe perhaps, is that we have seen a profound compendium of legitimate dissatisfaction, right? So, there's always people in society who are dissatisfied because, not everybody is thriving as much as others. Not every group is getting its demands satisfied. I think, what we have seen over the past decades is that there's been this sort of concatenation of various groups that feel themselves to have not been doing well under the existing establishment or democratic institutions. I stressed sort of economic dissatisfaction and dissatisfaction with some of these broad cultural issues just because those are the ones that we talk about most. It's certainly the case that religious conservatives, or some religious conservatives, have felt themselves in the United States who've been under particular attack from the left, and that has probably made them not only more attached to the Republican Party, but as I mentioned with regards to populism, willing to attach themselves to a figure who in many ways we would not have thought of as their natural champion, but feeling themselves under attack. When people feel under attack, defending themselves becomes their priority. And that can be dangerous, not because it isn't legitimate for groups to want to defend what they see as their interest, but when they're willing to do that in a way that potentially undermines the rules of the game. And I think it's very important for us as small d Democrats to differentiate that, right? So when you talk about democracy, that means that you are allowed to pursue whatever policy objectives you want, whether their policy objectives have to do with lower taxes or higher taxes, more complete separation of church and state, more accommodation for religious interests. Those are all kosher, so to speak, to use a semi-religious term. The problem is when you do that and you're willing to achieve those goals by undermining the institutions and procedures that allow others to do that further on. So I agree with you. Clearly, what we have here is not just people who are economically dissatisfied, people who are upset about, whatever it is, illegal immigration, but other groups that feel themselves to have been under attack somehow, and therefore perhaps, as I mentioned, willing to ignore, if not condone, attacks on the institutions and procedures that allow us to continually to try to litigate these various conflicts.
What about the institutional dimension of the church-state separation?
Well, we have a very particular understanding of church-state separation here. It's entirely different, for instance, from the one that exists in France, right? So, and we have a corpus of constitutional and other law that's come up around that. Now, advocating for certain kinds of changes to that might be something that I might disagree with or others might, but that's not a problem, right? The problem is the way in which you do that, right? Do you do that within the existing, again, rules of the game or not, right? But you're allowed to advocate for change. That's what democracy is all about, yeah?
Well, hearkening back to the first presentation we heard from Professor Bartlett, and the importance of the mixed polity, I think was very provocative, and it presaged in a way, I think, perhaps some of the lessons of the French Revolution and what followed, in terms of the growing importance of a bourgeoisie as the kind of ballast of the parliamentary democracies that we inherited in large part from the post-Enlightenment period. The more I hear this conversation go on, and it's been very rich to consider the questions across different periods and geographies, the more I am struck at the recurrent nature of so many of these challenges, and that they change form depending on the different economic developments and different commercial developments, but we see them recurrently. I'm going to allow just time for three more questions, and then we're going to break for a reception. Please keep your questions brief, and I will gather them. I'll go first here, and then to the back, and then to the front.
Hi, thanks so much to all the speakers. I have a question for Professor Bartlett on something that's really been bothering me. You cited a passage of Aristotle's that I found quite striking, which was something to the effect of, it's nobler to preserve a regime than it is to found one. And it seems so contrary to the conventional way of looking at it. I'm reminded of a Lincoln speech, someone you've also cited, which goes to the effect of, one of the problems with America is that, we've set up the just political order, so the founders get all the glory, and we latecomers, there's nothing left for us. And so we run the risk of, when someone is born in Napoleon, say what he calls the tribe of the eagle, that they will be tempted to tear down the order for want of being able to find glory within it. So, are Lincoln and Aristotle at cross purposes here? Is part of what Aristotle's doing a rhetorical, he's trying to dissuade tyrants? I guess, how do you make resilience glorious? It wasn't a problem for Lincoln himself because he got the double glory of refounding, which is to found and to preserve at the same time. So what do we do?
Thank you. I'm going to go to the back for, if you could just, to the back row. Thank you.
Hello. My question is for Professors Hwang and Easter. We often talk about mores and values when we talk about democracy. And in both of the situations that you describe, it seems to me that there was an effort at an extraordinary change in values in an extraordinarily brief amount of time. And I assume that there was some sort of extensive effort at education. I don't think they just brought in, handbags and strippers or something.
No, they did do that in Eastern Europe.
And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to the efforts at education that were carried out in these two places. It seems like in South Korea you were able, but South Korea was able to form a citizenry with a surprisingly robust backbone when it comes to standing up for democracy. This doesn't seem to have been the case in Eastern Europe. I was wondering if you two have any insights into the role that education played in these differing outcomes.
Thank you. And a final question from Yusuf Shahed in the first row, and then we will have a lightning round of replies from the panel.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you for this very interesting discussion. My question for my neighbor, Professor Berman. You talk about the disconnect between the delivery and what people are expecting. I believe that this disconnect existed for many years, and people wait for an election to either vote or express their dissatisfaction or their satisfaction. What's happening now is that social networks and media are accelerating and exacerbating this disconnect. And so people, they are no longer able to wait for an election, and they wait immediate results, and they are no longer able to wait for a full mandate to see if they have to vote again. And I think this disconnect, the growing disconnect that you mentioned, is really a threat to democracy, because also it is attacking a principle, which is the vote and the election day, etc. So how do you see the role of social networks and also media in the in the resilience or collapse of a democracy?
Thank you. So we are going to just give a minute and a half to each speaker to reply, starting first with Professor Hwang and going around to conclude with Professor Berman.
That's a great question. Actually, the majority of those protesters on the streets and female students, women, late teens, early 20s, and plus later generations. Well, later generation might have some lived memories, but those young youth students without having the proper historical understanding, that's crux of identity, and it's impossible to confront directly guns and muzzles and tanks. It's not possible. And then especially those soldiers, how could they resist? And so it's historical, proper understanding, education, it's essential parts. And that's what I emphasized in my talk. Thank you.
So in Eastern Europe, the sources that may have been come into the region to expose the region to what we might call Western liberal democratic values. So I would say that they, in terms of the formal education system, that there was at best marginal influence and redoing a curriculum in that vein. Outsiders that may have come in, unless you're talking about the business school and the capitalism, but also intellectual outsiders who came in and helped to rewrite history books for grade school and for high school. They're often from the diaspora community. And they're infused with a very particular nationalist point of view, which often lends itself to post-liberal politics. And the writing of the official textbooks is a political battleground there, and post-liberal elites have won it over up and down the region. The church is involved with writing books, politicians, etc. And at this point, the influence from the West might be NGOs, although now with USAID out of business, they may be less effective, and Hollywood, which I'm not sure what kind of liberal values you get from popular Hollywood movies of,
Thank you. Professor Bartlett.
Go.
Austin, thank you for that question, which is a terrific question. And I like the juxtaposition between Lincoln and Aristotle, but to some extent you extrapolate too much from the quote. What he says is to found a city for 1 or 2, 3 days, that's not so great. You got to make the thing last. He's not meaning to denigrate the act of founding. Earlier in the Politics, he says that one who first founded law and right is responsible for the greatest of goods, without which we are the worst of animals. So, and there's several treatments of great founders in his writings. But in that context, he wants to say, look, take your eyes off the glory prize and to attain the truly great political good of longevity or stability in a regime. So yeah, there's a certain rhetorical character to it, I think.
Thank you. And I leave the final word to Professor Sheri Berman.
So thank you for your question. Thank everybody here for all the questions. I think what I want to say, let me say 2 quick things. One is, I think all that I was trying to do was something very simple, right? Which is that we spend a lot of time, correctly so, thinking about populists or, pseudo-authoritarians as causes of democratic decay. We look at the ways they attack institutions, undermine institutions. That's absolutely a reasonable thing for us to do. I think we need to also spend at least as much time thinking about them as symptoms, right? The fact that they exist, that people support them, that people condone their attacks on these institutions is a symptom of a very deep democratic dissatisfaction among the population. So we need to combine those two things to see them as symptoms as causes. The question about social media is very, very complicated. I would say my reading of that literature or that research says that perhaps the most negative thing that social media has done is not so much radicalize huge numbers of people, although clearly it has done that to some individuals, but rather bring people together of like-minded disposition and enable them to think that that view is really not only very common, but that they can live within a world with only people like that. And so, you end up getting people who really are convinced, again, that this view is totally correct because the people that they interact with are people who think just the way they do. Cross-cutting cleavages are absolutely necessary to make democracy work. Social media allows people, or is one of the things that allows people, I think, to not be involved with other people, encounter other people, be forced to deal with other people who have different opinions from them.
Well, thank you to all of the panelists. Thank you all for being here. Please join us for a reception, and see you at the next event.